So joining us for our lightning talk, all the way from Portugal, the winner of the Thinking Tester of the Year Award of the Jerry Weinberg Testing Excellence Awards in 2001, sharing his personal examples of failure and how to turn on embarrassing situations into a valuable but comical lesson. We have Filipe Freire.
All right. Can you folks hear me? Hello? Sound check 1, 2, 3. Hello, hello. Failure happens. Hey folks, I'm going to give you like a really quick talk. I don't expect to keep you for very long. Thank you for the kind introduction. Now, I work as a software tester or a test engineer. I'm not going to bore you with all of the details of my current company or my past companies. You can stalk me on my blog and find all that sort of information there. Now, the mood for a talk is strictly a personal mood in the sense that I'm not here trying to sell you anything, or I'm not here trying to represent a company, so to speak, and mostly so I don't get sued for the things that I'm going to talk about. And it's typically this thing of you'll realize it in a second, but it's typically this thing of one moment everything is okay, and the next moment you get a bird pooping on your watch. And that's the same watch, by the way. It's clean, I can lick it and stuff like that. Don't worry. So yeah, views are strictly personal. Don't sue me. So what we're going to talk about is pretty much two stories that happened to me and my colleagues in different jobs that I had, and a couple of about failure, and a couple of guiding principles that we followed after the failures happened in order, to try to get us out of those rough failures. And the first one is the story I like to call the war room, so to speak. It happened back when I was working with Adidas. We were building a piece of software that, if you're like a sneakerhead and you've heard about Yeezys and Air Jordans and all that kind of fancy shoes, and if you've ever used the Adidas app for the raffle to get those exclusive shoes, you probably touched the software that we helped build. And this was back in July 2019, so before the COVID pandemic and whatnot. And we were all in this war room. We were about to do a product launch. Our egos were up the roof because we had like did dry runs before. We launched like some smaller, less exclusive shoes before, a few months before. So this was like a major drop that we were doing to prove ourselves. And if you've ever worked like at a big corporation, there's always this thing of you're trying to prove yourself to senior leadership that you want your new product, the new thing that you're building to work, and to prove them, hey, we've done this, we're like underdogs, and ego up the boost. And you can probably think of a few red flags already just from like that mindset of ego. It kind of creates a lot of blind sides and whatnot. And you can probably guess you can probably guess what happened next in that particular job. So everything was dying. And worse than that, it wasn't the fact that, a live drop that you can only handle for that amount of time. It wasn't the fact that everything was dying. It was also the fact that we didn't know what was dying. We didn't know what was happening with the thing that we just built, that it's not working as it was intended to work, so to speak. And we get all of these feelings of like despair and shame. I felt personal shame as a software tester, like how could I let so many of these failures and problems, go past me. I love hunting down for bugs and all these things. But mostly like we felt lost, because the next few days we each flew back to our own offices. We were there in Germany just for that drop, and afterwards folks returned. I returned. I was living back then in Spain, and other folks returned to Slovenia and whatnot. We still had a lot of problems to solve, and we still had a lot of rocks to break, and we didn't know even when to start looking or where to start looking and whatnot. So that brings us to our first guiding principle, sort of like personal guiding principle of diving deeper. Deeper in the sense of like, you have to be diligent, similar to what we just heard in the previous talk. You have to be really diligent about the unknown and unexpected, both from a testing perspective, but in many other ways. So for instance, in the 2 years after that picture that I just showed you, we faced a lot of embarrassing bugs. We We had the typical problems that you'll find if you are used to running stuff in production, like weird stuff like your infrastructure is dying, or DNS, it's always DNS problems, or bad cache invalidation. We had all these different issues and whatnot. Now, there was a flip that switched in our heads from that first moment of embarrassment and whatnot. And even though we faced all these issues, it was the fact that we were no longer feeling lost. We were no longer, feeling. Or sometimes we did feel embarrassed when some of these happened, but we were no longer lost because we were diligent. From that moment onwards, we were like, we're going to hunt down for these problems before they happen, or even when they are happening, we're going to be diligent in setting stuff up so they don't happen again, or we hunt them down more easily, so to speak. And from that initial failure, the priority soon became like no-nonsense deep testing. Now, if you're a software tester like me, typically you might hear from folks from the self-proclaimed United Nations of testers, the ISTQB, you need to follow these standards and procedures and processes and whatnot. What that ends up meaning is that you'll do a lot of work for the sake of work being done, but you'll spend less of your time doing actual testing, experimenting with what you're building. It can be an API, it can be anything that you can think about. And that was one of the things that shifted for us. Anything that was like crappy and not bullshit like sort of testing that was done for the sake of showing work done, but it wasn't actually helping us find embarrassing bugs, helping us find problems. We cut that away. We were just focused on how can we make sure that the best part of our time is spent exploring and tinkering with the thing that we're building. The second thing in this sort of principle, following this sort of principle of diving deeper, was observability and instrumentation law. Notice that in that first episode that I told you about, we had really, really poor setup in terms of observability, in terms of how we instrumented our code, because we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know if the issue for that we were having in that moment, if it was like the database dying, or we didn't scale properly the pods that we needed to spin up in order to handle the load. Mind you that this kind of software had, we had to deal with quite huge spikes of load and whatnot. Like we didn't know because we had no way of observing the thing happening while it was still happening. So that became also one of our priorities. So from that moment onwards, we started instrumenting our code, adding a lot of building dashboards and whatnot, but also making sure that everything that was happening from the moment one of our users hit an endpoint in our API till the moment that something was written down in on Postgres, or something became cached or something like that, that we had like full scope and we could observe all of that happening, and we could deep dive on someone that is having like an error on the API return. We can deep dive and pull that apart and investigate that. And the third thing is we really focused a lot on meaningful load testing. What I mean by this is a lot of us, sometimes we get this idea that we're like Facebook or Google. So whenever we start thinking about load testing, we start thinking like, we need to, and especially in corporations, like we need to subcontract some load testing company that will actually sell you resell you used AWS instances, and you'll pay a shit ton of money for very poor load testing service and whatnot. And we need to load test thousands and millions and gazillions of requests per second and whatnot. That's not actually a meaningful way to approach a load testing problem. So what we did is, we noticed that a lot of the problems, in say 90%, and I'm throwing a number, it was revealed in my dreams, 90% of the problems that we end up finding, we could find them just by pumping the system with a little bit of load and just having that observability in place. You don't need, oftentimes in order for you to find like bugs that are related to load, you don't need a lot of load to put those on. What you need is actually some load, but also observability into your system and what you're trying to measure. And then, of course, you need a bit more load when you're trying to hunt down issues that come from large loads, like stuff that goes a bit into the realms of infrastructure and how you scale up things and whatnot, but not necessarily bugs within the software that is being attacked with load. And there's another principle that I touched a bit before, that is scrap. And not in the sense of like, especially when you're running systems in production and whatnot, not in the sense of cutting corners, because that was one of our initial mistakes, for instance, in that initial drop that we did. We cut a lot of corners, we didn't test things deeply enough and whatnot. But scrap in the sense of don't get, too lost on fixed process and whatnot. Is like, what's the quickest way that you have to solve a problem, but also to solve it in a way that you don't need to face that problem again, and reuse stuff that you learn as you go. And, sorry, we're going to go to the second story. This is what happened while I was still working with Digit Game Studio. I see folks from Digit, hey. That I like to call magical tools. A different kind of failure, a different kind of story, and you'll guess why soon. So we had, when I first joined, there was a recurring problem that was our testers and our non-technical folks and whatnot. Typically, there was a lot of back and forth between non-technical folks and engineers, like, our environments, test environments, are unstable, and we need them in order to do our jobs. And did something stop working? And how can I deploy something? And how can you fix the thing without telling what the thing is? So you have to ask even more questions. That thing when someone pings you on Slack, hi, and they don't say anything else. And we had a lot of back and forth like that and whatnot. And myself and Tom Shaw, we looked at that, and we saw an opportunity there, because we saw that a lot of the issues that we were facing, a lot of this back and forth, we could solve a lot of it using tools that any of these folks, technical and non-technical, they could use to ask these same kind of questions before in a self-sufficient manner and get the answers that they needed, or deploy what they needed to deploy without necessarily, having to be a big brain or having to have a lot of deep knowledge and previous knowledge. So we did just that. We started designing tools that were very simple, very documented. They were also portable. We loved using Docker, so we put everything into containers so that we could use them anywhere we wanted. And they were accessible. So, for instance, all of those questions that before folks would ask, they could call a Slack bot, or call a script on their spreadsheet, or a CLI on their console. And it would interface with our tools and get those answers back. It could be something like run some automated checks, some tests mimicking a player flow, or is this environment up and running, or what is actually deployed and how is that environment configured and whatnot. Now, guess what happens next after we started doing all of this and whatnot? Every time we would release a new tool, some folks would love it, like early adopters and whatnot, but a majority of folks, they didn't understand, or they didn't, sorry, that's a bit, failure happens, that's that image there. They didn't, it's not that, out of evil or whatever, they didn't want to use the tool, but a lot of folks missed, what was the purpose, what were we trying to achieve there and whatnot. So that brings us to another guiding principle that, since we've tried to follow, that is to create sort of feedback loops, and to be very diligent about this in the same level that you're thinking about when you're designing your tools, and listening and hunting for feedback and starting backwards, from this. So we realized that in order for our tools, not to fail, and not in the way of failing as the tool didn't do what it was promised to do, because they did that, but in order for people to actually use the tools, we needed to talk to people, a lot of people. We did something cool where we wanted to understand, how are people even, the ones that are using the tool, how are they even using the tool? So we set up analytics on the usage, and we knew exactly what commands are people mostly using, what should we support more, what should we not support, what not, and making onboarding beautiful in the tool. You don't want to read the document in order to understand how the tool uses. Some folks like reading documents, others don't. Why not the tool telling you, hey, giving you a few examples, hey, in order to use me, write this command or call me in this way and whatnot. And this serves a bit as a cautionary tale, lack of feedback can really, and we understood this and we went through this, lack of feedback, if we don't have these feedback loops in place, they can make a wonderful thing that you've just built, completely fail in the sense that people won't use it and whatnot. Which brings me to my final principle, bonus principle in a way, that is to empathize. A lot of the problems that, I can tell you a lot of problems we faced through time, they were, like Gerald Weinberg would tell you, people problems. Not necessarily, technical problems per se, but problems in how somebody has some expectations set, or problems in how you communicate with people and whatnot. So you really need to, one of the guiding principles that I would recommend you follow is always try to empathize with people, even if, sometimes they're being not positive to you or being a bit assholes or something like that. Always empathize. And that's it. That's all I wanted to share with you folks. So as I told you, it's really small talk, wrapping up all these guiding principles that I talked to you, dive deeper, scrap when you need to, create feedback loops, and empathize. And that's pretty much it. Thank you. Like I told you, you can stalk me at my website, philfreire.com. And I'm happy, if you bump into me, I'm happy to talk with you and whatnot. I probably can't tell you a lot of the secrets of Adidas stuff and whatnot, but who knows. Thank you.